Our next speaker is Dr. John Fitzpatrick, Professor and Emeritus Director, Cornell Lab of Ornithology. His talk today is Local Ups and Downs in Bird Populations, Recent Revelations from Deep Analysis of eBird Citizen Science Data.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming out this morning, and it's a pleasure to be the bird guy on this otherwise plant-dominated discussion of our yards. There will be from time to time in this series of slides, I hope, a few things that do relate directly to how you use your yard, and I want to second many of the things that Craig mentioned about being wise and caring about how you use your yard, because there are a lot of things that now more than ever are depending on it. Another title of this talk, in a slightly different guise, has been Wild Birds Are the Canaries and Our Planet is the Coal Mine. In the case of today, think of that as your backyard is the coal mine. And it is no exaggeration, of course. I think most of you know that this idea of canary in the coal mine is actually absolutely true, particularly in Great Britain. Canaries were used as indicators of something suddenly going wrong, going desperately wrong with the habitat that these miners were in. The canary was more sensitive than the humans to the noxious gases in those mines. They warned the humans to get out, warned the humans to take care about what the habitat was that they were in. That's what birds are doing for us all over the world today. And I'll give you just a snapshot of some of the things we're learning from this amazing database, and I'll do a couple of asides as I go. When I talk about birds to almost anybody, I always want to emphasize how powerful they are. They're powerful to us and have been for millennia for four main reasons that I want to just quickly go through. Number one, they have, again, since Aristotle's day, been incredible models for how nature works. Very accessible, highly varied, behaviorally, structurally, and they just teach us. It's no accident that most of the main axioms of evolutionary biology, ecology, behavior, and environmental management have at their roots work done with birds, because they teach us so much. That's not all they do. They're incredibly sensitive environmentally. They are the canaries, the proverbial canaries. They are great barometers or environmental indicators, and I'll give you one little example of that here in a few slides, close to your home. As habitat goes bad, bird populations decline. That allows us to read how things are going out there and perhaps ultimately to fix it. Number three, they are, by virtue of the fact that billions of them, literally, migrate twice a year across the planet. They provide us a look at the heartbeat of Earth's annual cycle. And I'll show you a few heartbeats here in just a second. And finally, and I regard this as the most important of these four, they sing to us. Not just literally, but they sing to us figuratively. They draw us into nature. They become part of our hearts. They appeal to the nonlinear, to the spiritual, to the emotional side of our being. And in that way, they draw us into nature in ways that little else in nature is as powerful at doing that. Put all these four things together, and you'll see what I mean about how much we can rely on the powers of birds to understand our relationships with this planet, and ultimately, finally, figure out how we can live side by side with functional, intact, natural systems. I think probably all of you have heard, if not seeing the paper itself, you've heard on the news over a couple of years ago, 2019, we published this paper. The Lab of Ornithology was principal authors with a large number of colleagues from the US and Canada, showing that the North American continent has lost something on the order of 30% of its breeding bird populations over the last 50 years. That's a huge drop in just 50 years. 3 billion birds at the beginning of a breeding season, fewer than there were in 1970. And alarmingly, every single group, ecological group of birds, except waterfowl, were showing this decline. So this is not just true of a few birds showing great big signals. This is true of almost every kind of bird there is across North America. What's going wrong? And big question, is it conceivable for us to bend the curve, to stabilize things and begin to bring these populations back? More urgently, we actually wanted to find out, because this study was of the last 50 years from 1970 through the end of the 20-teens. We want to find out, is this still going on, or was this a signal that started back in the 70s and we've now stabilized now? So the question is, how can we measure in near real time whether bird populations are declining, stabilized, or increasing? Now that particular study got its main data from two sources, not eBird, because eBird hadn't been invented until the early 2000s. That study used the breeding bird surveys, 50 years of breeding bird surveys, and it also used this amazing array of radar stations, 140 radar stations across the US, and it allowed us, in a way that I'm going to describe to you in a second, to literally count the birds that were moving north and south. And I want to just illustrate that, because this is the edge of a new frontier, namely the idea that we can use birds to literally measure population changes in real time, or very near real time. We've never been able to do this before in the history of humans on Earth. I think you might know what this picture is. This is from the NEXRAD radar. This is what your weathermen use to, and women use to tell us when it's going to rain and when it's going to be sunny. But what we've done is we've taken the problematic stuff in there called rain out. And if you see, as night falls here, as this slide is progressing, you suddenly see the whoa, as the sunset moves to the west, you see the place light up with blue, what the weather people call ground clutter. That's birds. We got rid of the rain and started asking, can we use this NEXRAD system to actually count the birds? The answer is amazing. Here are the dots during one particular night. That was September 11th, 2016. And by using statistical splining techniques, we can actually come across, average across the landscape and say that night, this particular time, that's the flight of birds that was in the air during that particular moment on that night of September 11th. Thanks to the radar system, we can do that every single night. We can do it hour by hour, all night long for the entire migration season. I'm going to show you a migration season in full flow, beginning on March 1st. And here you can see the arrows are showing the direction of bird flight. The background light shows you the density of birds, and as we get into April, you can see, as you know well, April and May, we begin to get this monstrous flight of birds from the tropics up through particularly the middle part of the country and on up to the breeding grounds of North America. That's an amazing event that happens twice a year. Of course, if you look at the fall one, that's the opposite direction. What we then did, a bunch of really smart postdocs at the lab, said we can actually create a website, maybe you have visited this place, called Birdcast, which can say, given the weather that's coming, we can actually predict what the next 5 or 7 days are going to look like, given what we know about what's going on with the weather. And so here's a night of April 4th. The prediction was that the density of birds would look about like that, like you see on that map there. Here's the actual measurement at one point on that 4th of April. The prediction, if I can read this right, was 76 million birds in air in midnight. The actual was 75.4. These guys got really, really good at determining where the birds were going to be in the following day and 2 and 3 days away. including quantitatives. And in the process of doing this, one thing became starkly clear to us about bird migrations, especially in the spring. Namely, there are a few major corridors where literally 1 billion birds move overhead. We know from work that we've done, especially in New York City, that lights in cities are dramatically disrupting migration because they attract birds just like moths. And so the question is, can we actually use this information to convince the biggest cities in this corridor, in particular Houston and Dallas, and then up in there in Chicago, to lower their lights? The answer is yes, this is an ongoing and succeeding process. Could we also use this as a way of asking wind farms on particular nights, 2 or 3 or 4 nights is all they would need to do to reduce 90% of the collisions with migratory wildlife? So we now have the opportunity to be affecting in real time the behaviors of humans with respect to lights, and not that wind farm operators are not human, but the industry that depends on wind the same way birds do to change their behaviors, and we're optimistic about that. In the process of doing this, we did that slide. You've seen a miniature version of it before. This just shows you that during an average spring, 3.5 billion birds migrate up from the tropics into North America. About 2.6 of those go on up into Canada. The following fall, 4 billion moved back. Guess what happened? They made babies. And 4.7 billion head that back down the tropics. So we can actually use this ongoing radar system to get our first-hand look at what the actual global scale population of birds is in North America. And finally, just this year, these guys realized that we could actually create a dashboard which would allow you at any given time to go to this site and ask the question, how many birds are in flight right now? What's the total that have flown by up until this hour of tonight? And how does that compare with the average, and so on? So this dashboard is now available to the world to watch on every given migration night. So I invite you to go visit. Now I want to quickly give a follow-on to Craig's point about fire. I'm going to show you very quickly about a bird in your backyard. I've been privileged to work with this bird for the last 50 years. Clap if you think this bird should be the state bird of Florida. Clap if you will write your state senators and assemblymen. So there is a bill underway still right now, again, and I think we can eventually defeat the dark side that keeps thinking that it's be some tragedy if this bird, as it should, represent the state of Florida. As you know, this bird is scarce, limited to a very few places. We mapped the entire statewide population in the early 1990s. Studies, and by the way, we're going to start another map this year. They live in small family groups. The kids stay home and help spread the family values that the state bird should have. Mockingbirds. Do you know that mockingbirds, 40% of the young birds that hatch out of a mockingbird's nest were sired by the neighbor, not by the guy who's feeding them. Okay? Not so in the Florida scrub jay. 0 extra pair parentage in this bird. I can go on, but that's a different talk. The main point I want to talk about is that this bird, we were watching a population of scrub jays adjacent to our main study area go extinct in the 70s and 80s. And we began to hypothesize at that time that this bird required some relationship with fire. So what did we do? We burned the place right there. That's our postdoc escaping his experiment. And our job was then to measure how they did after that. And long story short, we watched this population immediately begin to rise up to a very dense population, stayed stable for only a few years. During that period, there's an optimal phase since fire for Florida scrub jays to make babies and have those babies survive. That second part is really important. Followed by almost the identical population crash we'd been watching in the 70s and 80s. So in 2010, we burned it again. That was exactly 20 years later. And lo and behold, we're in the process of watching that go on again. It's actually just gotten to the peak again right now and is about to go back down. So what we've proven, we've asked the jays to teach us what the typical original fire cycle to which they were adapted was. Because we can't go back in time and measure it. We can measure how organisms respond to it and infer what it was. We are now advising all of the state and local and federal agencies that are managing landscape with Florida scrub in it that this window of fire from 8 to 12 to 14 years, that's the typical fire cycle for Florida scrub. And the consequences are huge for a wide variety of plants and small organisms that occur in this unique habitat mixture in Central Florida. The big point here is that if you burn it, there will live. These birds require fire as much as they require water. They just require it at a different frequency. So natural landscapes throughout Florida are fire maintained at a variety of fire cycle intervals depending on the specific local features, the soil, and so on. And the idea here, the reason for putting this in, besides giving you a sense of your own backyard bird, is that this bird is an indicator of a natural habitat that is either in balance and being managed in a way that mimics nature, or it's not, because if it's not, the bird's going extinct. So the idea that birds are ecological indicators is well shown now in habitats all across the world. And incidentally, since I'm here in Indian River County, I just want to pay homage to the folks that are banding some jays in the several different scrub preserves from Sebastian south to Wabasso. And it turns out that those birds, those little tiny patches of scrub, which many people, myself included 20 years ago, regarded as wasted energy because they're doomed. No way. These little patches, if there's a pair or two of scrub jays in your little patches in this county, they are actually supplying propagules that are going up and visiting from time to time other larger patches. So there is a genetic exchange going on even among these very small stepping stone-like populations. It's a very exciting revelation that has come out, and some of the best work on it has been done right here in Indian River County. And here's just a quick hats off to the idea that Florida, all of us ought to be doing everything we can to support the notion that we can in fact connect all of these wild habitats one way or another across the entire peninsula of Florida. It's a national leadership movement that's underway right now. The Florida Wildlife Corridor is genuinely being looked at as a model for other parts of the U.S. Back to birds and on to eBird. If only we could actually measure bird populations on the ground on a real-time basis. Well, the fact is that you all, anybody here who regularly watches birds with binoculars or out your backyard at your feeder, you're part of a huge army, tens of millions of people who do this. And the idea is, can we actually recruit the army to give us the information that we would need if we wanted to do real-time measuring of these birds? And the honest fact is that's exactly why we invented the prototypes of eBird and finally the real thing in 2002, 20 years ago exactly. And I'm happy to say that through careful listening to the users of eBird year after year after year, we've worked constantly to make it better and more productive and more useful for the individuals that use it for their various purposes. The consequence of that is that it has grown and grown and grown. It continues to grow at something between 15 and 25% annually. So we're now getting almost 2 million checklists per month, every month of the year, from every country in the world. So this is a global, it's a completely new thing for humanity to have a way of, in real time, putting information into a common database, publicly available database, to be following how things are doing. Through the end of 2022, you can see the data there. It's not a map of the world, it's actually just a plot of all the eBird localities. There's, I think, almost 3.5 million eBird localities now. 83 million checklists, 1.3 billion observations of birds in this database. That's an enormous amount of information about living dynamic systems. The largest such effort in the world. It's available now in a bunch of languages. And it's also backed up now by this, what I call the companion program or companion app called Merlin, which, raise your hand if you have Merlin on your phone. All right, I don't need to be. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, I really recommend it if you watch birds. It's a way of helping you identify the birds and even identifying the songs that you're hearing now as of last year. And Merlin is now available for almost every bird species in the world. And ultimately, we will have Merlin packs for every country in the world. We're very close to having that through at this point. So we have eBirders and prospective eBirders being assisted by something in their phone that can help them actually make correct identifications as they watch. In addition to those, that piece of software, I also want to put a plug in that in 2015, we experimented with the idea that you could send in a photograph with eBird checklists to sort of verify or just put a good photo that you took. We've just hit 40 million photographs in the database of eBird. There's the picture of this little parakeet from Australia that was the 40 millionth photograph submitted in November. It's the Australian ringneck, a bird I can't wait to see someday. The key to this enormous database is that we can, with clever statisticians and artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can start to build really sophisticated programs to control for all the nuisance variables, which there are a lot, and compare this data against a bunch of distributed data sets like Landsat imagery and human population density and so on, to be able to then actually make correct model predictions for where birds are every single week of the year as of today. And so what we're going to see now is a variety of outputs. Some of you perhaps played with these already. This is one that we've had this was one of our first experiments in this. This is barn swallow, and you're seeing it. Remember I mentioned the heartbeat of the Earth's annual cycle. There we go. There's barn swallow in the summer. You can see how important Florida is in its migratory pathway down to South America. Many of them go all the way down to Argentina, and a small population actually is now beginning to breed down there without having to come back, which is really interesting. Can you hit the animation, please, for this one? This is hooded warbler, and I want to emphasize what we're learning with these. There we go. We're going to just watch the annual, it's a one-time annual cycle. Look how important the Yucatan Peninsula is to hooded warblers in the winter. There's its breeding habitat and densities. Florida gets kind of bypassed by this bird. But I'm putting this on because it has we can see a couple of different features of this bird. I'm going to go to the next slide. We can take the weekly usage of habitat by this bird and plot it out on a map to show its entire annual cycle. Blue for winter, red for breeding, yellow for migratory, and that is the most accurate map ever made for this species. In fact, our set of maps like this, these abundance maps we call them, and weekly distribution maps, are the most accurate maps ever made for any organism in the world. Compare that map, which is what the field guides of the future, and we're working on one now, by the way, will have as the maps, as the distribution maps for these species. Compare that with what your standard field guides show for the same thing. I refer to those things as blobs. We don't need to, for birds, we don't need to show blobs anymore to show the distributions, because we can actually show all the heterogeneity of the different spatial uses of of different spots and habitats through eBird data. And we can do this for organisms all over the world. Little by little, we're accumulating species for which enough information exists that we can make these full cycle maps like this white stork. Look at the complicated relationship that the white stork has with space across the old world. Here's one. If you can hit the animation again, this is a cool look at the pied cuckoo, which winters largely in southern Africa, breeds mainly on the Indian Peninsula, and then comes back across the Indian Ocean to head back down to southern Africa. A few linger there in southern India. We're going to go on, and so there's it's a comparable map. Now, this is drum roll time, because unless you've been peeking very recently at the eBird website, science section, you haven't seen this before. Because in late November of this past year, just 6 or 8 weeks ago, we released to the public for the first time something that we've been dreaming about. It's been the holy grail of work with eBird since we first conceived of it back 20 years ago. Namely, the question is, can we actually use these data on an annual basis to ask the question, how's the population doing through time? Can we start relying on the eBird database to show us real-time population changes? The answer requires, again, sophisticated statistics to remove a whole bunch of noise and variables that can confound the calculation. Not least of which, by the way, is that the usage of eBird has gone up steadily through that whole time. So we have to build in ways of making sure we control for the fact that there's more people using it, more people who may be novice birders, so we don't know that is not. So we have a whole lot of ways of going into individual data, not with your name, but with your number, and estimating how good you were at doing the job. And making sure that when we're doing work for this purpose, namely not presence, absence, or even local abundance, but for individual annual changes in population, we need to be super careful about what kinds of variables we use and how we correct for the biases. That said, newsflash, annual eBird maps now are being used for the first time to estimate local population trends, and I regard this as the beginning of a brand new era of understanding humans' relationships with landscapes, using birds as the tool. And you'll see what I mean, because what we want to do is not just say, how's the big population doing? Ideally, because we have these maps across space and time, how's the population doing where you live? As opposed to, how's it doing where your cousin lives, or your parents, or your schoolmates across the continent? How's it doing locally? And here's your first look, for many of you I suspect, of such a map. This is that same hooded warbler I'm using as the example. And what you're seeing is where the individual pixels, which are 27 kilometers on a side, where they're red, the population is declining. Where they're blue, it's increasing. The larger the circle in each of those little pixels, the more abundant the bird is. So you can see this particular example, hooded warbler. There's a whole stretch up the Appalachians, especially the interior side of the Appalachians where the population is declining. But look, there's a pretty big area in the southwestern part of its range where it's increasing. You can't see it, but where I live in upstate New York, there's actually a bunch of rows of very, very light blue circles. This bird is actually increasing at the very northern edge of its range. We're going to now look at a couple of other things. Can you hit the animation? I think I put an animation of this beautiful, characteristic bird that is about to arrive. There's its winter distribution is South America. You can see how important Florida is for the breeding population. There are breeding swallowtail kites throughout the northern South American tropics. Notice that they leave the north entirely and they get down. There's a big population of wintering birds in southeastern Brazil that disappears entirely. I suspect many of those come all the way up here. How is this bird doing? Of all the birds, happens to be my wife's favorite bird. It's probably true for some of you as well. Nothing like watching one of these in the sky. And how is it doing? Well, I'm happy to say that pretty much the Florida population and on into the southeastern U.S., the numbers are actually growing. There are really only a very few spots where the numbers of this bird appear to be declining, but certainly this North American population is healthy and showing signs of actual population growth as measured by eBirders. We do know that that correlates with the fact that it's being noticed farther and farther north. During the summer, vagrant swallowtail kites are being seen almost every year as far north as Minnesota and Wisconsin, and even in the Northeast. So this bird's got some things going well for it. Be fun to actually dive in as we now can, because we have these local pixels, and figure out what it is that's going so well. So it gives us a chance to actually study the individual biology of these birds once we're clued into patterns like this. So I'm going to show you a few more of these patterns. And it's a little like watching fire, because you could do this all afternoon. But you can, because there's like 1,500 of these available now on the eBird website under the Science tab. So you can go explore any species you want if we've done the mapping on it. I put this in as I've got a couple of bird quizzes here. What's this bird that is, pretty much there's no red pixel in this bird, including across Cuba. Who wants to guess what that bird is? It's pretty much restricted to Florida, little populations along the Gulf Coast. Any guess? Now, I suspect that some of you say, oh, that's right, because if you go birding out of Stick Marsh or, Godwin, T.M. Godwin Preserve, you can see 15 limpkins at a crack now, which never was true before because of the introduced apple snail that is like 25 times as common as the native apple snail. So limpkins, I could show you the same slide for snail kites, which are also on full blue and increasing their population. They'll probably be taken off the endangered species list, I suspect, within the next few years. All right, and here's our national symbol. It's, again, it's relatively uncommon. That's why the blue dots are pretty small. But it's widespread across North America, on into Canada, and essentially blue everywhere. This is a familiar refrain. If you've been a bird watcher for a long time, there's more eagles now flying around than there have ever been in our lifetimes. And we actually worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years ago and did a population estimate. There are now 4 times more bald eagles known than there were since their last estimate in 2009. We suspect that partly that's an artifact of just a lot more data now about it. But anyway, the point is, there's never been this many bald eagles in the U.S. in your lifetime as there are today. Wonderful. The pirate and scavenger bird that is, right? Okay, here's another bird quiz. Widespread bird. Yeah, I'm just saying, do I remember which one this is? Yes, I think I do. Widespread bird, very common in Florida, as you can see. This is a non-breeding distribution. This is a wintering bird in Florida, and pretty common, quite common in Florida, along the Gulf Coast. And on up, even in the wintertime, to the northern states, although it gets rarer and rarer and rarer up there. What eats hawthorn berries in the winter? Craig? Yeah, what eats even more? American robin. All right, so cool bird. I actually regard the American robin as one of the most interesting birds in North America. It has a lot of amazing stories to it. No, don't have time to tell them all. In the winter, it becomes gregarious and nomadic and is entirely fruit-eating. So what's going on with American robins across their range, with the exception of some interior places in Texas, everywhere else, one of the most common and familiar backyard birds is disappearing. How can you help that bird? Greg? We worked like crazy on getting this thing. All right, one more bird quiz. Yes, I do remember this one. This is a really interesting one. In fact, I was talking about this bird with somebody just before we came up here. Look at the pattern before we reveal the identity. It's here in Florida. It's also all the way up the East Coast to Toronto and out to about West Texas. And pretty much it looks like in the southeast it's getting rarer, and across the north it's getting more common. Somebody shout out which wren this is. Thank you. This is really interesting. It is indeed getting more common in the north. I can attest to that, living up there. It's really knocked back by super cold winters, but we're not having very many of those nowadays. What's happening in Florida, I would love to know. There are definitely, I've been observing that out on the 32963, the barrier island habitats, very rare. I think it's very rare for reasons related to Craig's talk. Because out there on the barrier island, there is a lot of ornamentation in the planting decisions made by people up and down the island, where it looks pretty, but it's not thickets type vegetation that the Carolina wren uses. I would also love to talk, if there are some people, I think there's a speaker coming up who could help talk about mosquito control, because I just wonder about the effects of mosquito control on the overall arthropod diversity. Palm warbler, this one's bothers me like crazy because it's such a cool bird and it's so dependent on Florida. But evidently the birders' data indicate that this bird is really declining pretty precipitously in its global population. These birds breed on the bogs of Canada and winter pretty much in Florida, with a few down in Cuba as well. Loggerhead shrike is another bird that's declining regularly pretty much everywhere. That's been in the news for a long time. But the reason I put this up is I was totally unfamiliar with and surprised by the discovery that actually this central Great Plains, northern Great Plains population is actually increasing, which I had not heard that there was any place in the range of this bird, this cool bird, that is increasing. So it'd be really neat to be able to study the places where it's decreasing versus increasing. Can we learn something about what landscape features might be used to bend the curve back up for loggerhead shrike? I think I'm going to just move through catbird. Well, this is an animation that shows you how important Florida is in the wintertime for catbirds. I know I put this in because here's another fruit-eating bird that depends on your backyards as its principal wintering ground in Florida. And there's its breeding distribution and trend. And this is really interesting, and it's interesting. The fact is, let me go back and say, look, there's a big wintering population in the Mexican and Central American area, and then, of course, the big, thick population that we have. It's a very common bird here in the winter. And what the catbird breeding distribution shows is that the western birds are increasing. In the east, it's declining. The east, I suspect, are the birds that are wintering down here. So just like Carolina wren and perhaps a few other things, these guys really need thickets with fruit as a way of supporting them in the wintertime. All right, so there's a whole bunch of these maps. Explore them at your leisure on the eBird website. This is just a little snapshot of the actual tapestry of 500 or so maps of this kind that we've made. That little box shows you what the previous slide was. You can see there's a whole bunch of these different maps, and the key point here now is that, broadly speaking, there are a pretty large proportion more that are declining broadly than are increasing broadly. And of course, a bunch that are mixed, some increasing here, decreasing there, like that catbird example. Lots of individual stories now can be investigated on the basis of this kind of information. Some big patterns are being revealed. This interesting dichotomy between crow, which is declining probably because of West Nile virus, and the common raven increasing like crazy across the West. A few surprises. I'm just going to show a couple of surprises. Bald eagle, there you saw that map already. Fish-eating bird, doing great across this whole range. Here's another big fish-eating bird, declining pretty much everywhere. The great blue heron, declining. In the places where it's the most common, it's declining the most rapidly. What's going on with the great blue heron? We don't know. But maps like this can actually light bulbs and put antennae up and get us out there to trying to ask the question. Indeed, the more we look at whole guilds of birds, like marsh-inhabiting birds, the two blackbirds shown here, pretty hard declines. In fact, the red-winged blackbird is one of the biggest absolute numbers of declines in that 2019 paper in Science. What's going on in wetlands, perhaps affecting the heron, perhaps affecting marsh birds? We do know that mercury has now been exposed. It has been revealed that modern day birds, especially ones inhabiting wetland kinds of habitats, are showing significantly elevated levels of mercury compared to specimens taken way back at the early part of the 20th century. So is the 99% loss in rusty blackbirds a consequence of mercury poisoning? It's the most mercury affected of all the birds that were tested during that study. So again, population declines revealing us something. We can dive in and actually ask questions about what's going on given the antennae that are raised from these studies. Whole guilds, aerial insectivores. What's going on with all the swallows? The barn swallow is now a species of concern in Canada and may go on to their threatened species list. But all these swallows, the nighthawks, whippoorwills, all the aerial insectivores declining. Well, wonder why. Have you heard of the insect Armageddon? The fact is that worldwide there's increasing evidence that wholesale destructions and losses of insect populations. I have this slide, which I circled because I sometimes give a talk like this to fly fishermen. And those circled things are the main foods for trout in North America, and they are showing some of the biggest declines of all the insect populations. In grasslands, we're seeing the same pattern, almost ubiquitous, of species that breed across grasslands. You can see that across the Great Plains entirely, these are just wholesale declines of all those grassland inhabiting species. No doubt a consequence in part of horizon-to-horizon farming, of the large-scale mechanized farming of this century. But also there are increasing hotspots out there in the Great Plains that may be contributing to this. And in addition, the pervasive use of neonicotinoids is increasingly alarming to many ecologists, myself included. There's some good evidence coming out of work in Europe, especially using some citizen science data on bird populations and water chemistry, that populations of birds that are in the most neonicotinoid-rich areas are declining faster than those in the less used areas. Also evidence that ozone may be an issue. There's this neat study that we did together with some scientists from the business school at Cornell that showed that thanks to the Clean Air Act, certain parts of the U.S., in particular eastern U.S., had a lot of controls put on sulfur dioxide production in various kinds of outputs. And in the places that sulfur dioxide production was the highest, that is, the production was changed the most, the bird populations actually increased during that area. And the correlation is amazingly tight between the amount of change in sulfur dioxide and the amount of change in bird populations, suggesting that ozone itself, which is a byproduct of sulfur dioxide, may be a real feature. This paper actually argued that the Clean Air Act may have actually saved 1 billion birds from disappearing in that process of that analysis that we did. Well, I'm going to close here by just asking you to imagine what stories are taking place in your backyard. Think of all the stories that exist in that slide. You've got some favorite places, and there may be stories right under your nose that the birds will have begun to tell you. By putting your information into the eBird database, you'll be contributing to the ongoing annual production of these trend maps that allow us to actually learn more in real time about how we're doing in managing this landscape. Remember, we're trying to figure out how to live side by side with these natural systems. We're not doing a great job of that so far. But we do have a proxy that's now available to us, and we have some mechanisms for actually using that proxy to our advantage. So I just want to close by showing you what I get to look at, Molly and I get to look at on our fall afternoons in Ithaca as the leaves turn. That's the spot that's across the valley from our back deck. It looks like this a lot of the time. Why am I here in Vero? Oh yeah. This is our home. It's our only home. It's our place of worship for many of us. We can fit in with all this grandeur as long as we keep working on it. And I close with the slide of a success story, a bird that's on its way off the endangered species list. Never give up. Thank you very much.
Terrific talk.